Can you tell us some of the dirt you've done as a Scientologist? Okay, and I want people to understand, I was a fundamentalist. I know many people who are cult members who are fundamentalists. You 100% reading this book were a fundamentalist. You were, I'll say, a nut job, okay, just like me. Anything that says you were all about it, you were all in, it is the truth. And once you are convinced in that, everything else needs to be, attacked or disproven or whatever. What kind of fair game, when you were at the upper echelons of Scientology, or even when you tried to redeem yourself, tell us some of the dirt you did as a Scientologist.
Well, routinely put PIs onto investigating people. But when I say investigating, that means paying someone to go get their phone records, paying someone to go get their bank records, paying someone to surveil them, whether it's noisy, i.e. they sit in front of their house to intimidate, or quiet, where they're just kind of trying to find out who they're associating with. We would routinely give people or get people to get those. You remember those old phones that used to sit on a base that you pick up and walk around the house? I forget what they call them. They were like mobile phones before there were cell phones.
Right.
Okay.
Big ones too. Yeah.
Yeah. They're big hunkin' things. Those things, if you could get someone to get one of those phones and use it, you could sit in the house next door and tap into the frequency and listen to all their phone calls. That was a very routine thing that was done. Okay. I talk a lot in the book about Bob Minton. I took Bob Minton as sort of an example of what was done to attempt to destroy someone. And Bob Minton, for those who don't know, was never a Scientologist. He was never involved in Scientology. He was a financial guy from New England, Boston area, who came across this issue of Scientology and the death of Lisa McPherson, and decided that there was something wrong with this and something needed to be done about it. And he took it upon himself to finance various activities, protests, bring people to Clearwater, opened up a thing called the Lisa McPherson Trust. And for a while, he was like public enemy number one of Scientology. And at that point, I was the head of the Office of Special Affairs. So I brought this private investigator to Clearwater, and Marty Rathman and I met with him in his rental car in a parking lot and briefed him, saying, whatever you need to do, get Bob Minton out of our hair. We don't care what it is. We don't care how much money you spend. Your assignment is to get rid of him. Okay, while that private investigator, I'll tell you a bit about the story about what he did while he was off, we concurrently, here's what happens with an attacker of Scientology. You analyze them to find out what their weaknesses are, what their buttons are, the things that you can go after to threaten that will cause them to cease their activities. And Bob Minton was sort of known to have a bit of a temper. So there was a guy, Bob Minton used to go out and picket in front of the Fort Harrison. There was a guy who went out there and got in his face and started holding another, counter protest picket sign in his face. And Minton was like, got a little upset and pushed him. And this guy, of course, there was someone there with a video camera. He flopped like a soccer player trying to get a penalty and landed on the ground and started groaning and, oh my God, I'm injured. He assaulted me. So charges were filed against Bob Minton, and he got taken by the police and put in prison overnight, or the local jail. And, eventually he was acquitted. But at that point, we were able to say Bob Minton is a violent criminal. So now we started saying Bob Minton's a violent criminal all the time. Okay, Minton had made a bunch of money selling bonds for various countries, one of whom the main one was Nigeria. And we believe that there was criminal activities involved in his dealings with Nigeria. The private investigator went to London and somehow, I don't know exactly how, managed to get in contact with a prominent Nigerian football player in London called John Fashanu. John Fashanu then went to the Nigerian embassy in London and persuaded the Nigerian embassy that this guy, Bob Minton, who he didn't know from a, you know, he would never have been able to recognize him if he ever even stood right in front of him, what had been ripping off money, and that he had it in Swiss bank accounts. So the Nigerian embassy contacted a prosecutor in Switzerland and managed to persuade the prosecutor to freeze Bob Minton's money. And this was all on speculation and all on the basis of someone got a hold of someone who knew someone who did something that resulted in his money being frozen. And apart from, you know, the constant people following him, taking his photograph, following his family, going to his business associates and asking questions, you know, like the technique is to go to someone who is associated with a person and ask questions. You don't go and say, oh, did you know that Bob Minton was smuggling drugs? You say, do you have any reason to believe that Minton might be involved in drug smuggling? And you plant this idea in people's mind. And if you do that often enough and to enough people, you start it's like
believing something's going on. You
yeah,
mentioned this in the opening of your book, actually, when you talk about how like you'd flinch, and then if you keep making them face it, eventually they won't flinch and they get used to it or even start to believe in a particular thing. Something psychological there's going on, and I wonder if it dives into his Dianetics or into L. Ron Hubbard's techniques. Sorry.
Well, it does, but it's more that Hubbard believed that you could silence criticism of Scientology by intimidating people into silence and shuddering them into silence is the words that he uses. And you know, you asked me, so what did you do? Well, this all was done to Bob Minton, and eventually he just said, I can't take this anymore. I want to live my life. I just want to be left alone now. And so, you know, and I talk about that in the book, how that all came about and what the ultimate resolution was. And interestingly, in the end, after I had left, I became quite good friends with Bob Minton before he unfortunately passed away. So these things are the run of the mill routine kind of actions that are done according to the Hubbard policies to those who are perceived as being the biggest enemies of Scientology. They can't get around to everybody. They don't have the resources to do that. They don't have enough manpower to run it. But if, you know, Leah and I are certainly at the top of the list at this point. Everybody who appeared on the Aftermath ended up with a smear website, and many of them had private investigators knocking on their doors, and they would get legal threat letters and that sort of stuff. So, you know, that's the kind of basic routine of Scientology, is to try and intimidate people into silence.